In the grand halls of Maplecroft Manor, a priceless cameo pendant vanishes, shattering a family reunion. But Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet wisdom, unravels a web of secrets, hidden safes, forged letters, and a nephew's desperate betrayal. As clues weave together, will truth mend a fractured family? Dive into a classic mystery where every stitch reveals a secret. Chapter 1. The Gathering at Maplecroft. Late October sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the rolling lawns of Maplecroft Manor, its ancient stone walls draped in ivy that glowed russet in the fading light. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a cushioned armchair by the drawing-room's tall window, adjusted her shawl and peered out with eyes that missed nothing. The Haverford family reunion, a tradition upheld with varying degrees of enthusiasm, had drawn a disparate crowd to this grand estate on the edge of St. Mary Mead. Lady Haverford, a widow of 60 with a penchant for dramatic gestures, had insisted Miss Marple attend, citing her uncanny way of seeing through people. Miss Marple, ever modest, had accepted with a polite smile, her knitting bag tucked beside her. The drawing-room buzzed with the chatter of arriving guests, their voices mingling with the clink of teacups and the crackle of logs in the fireplace. Clara Haverford, Lady Haverford's daughter, held court near the grand piano, her sharp tongue slicing through pleasantries with remarks about the weather's dreariness and the servant's slowness. Her brother, Edmund, a pale man with a scholar's stoop, hovered near a bookshelf, his nose buried in a volume of Keats, though his eyes darted nervously toward the door. Beatrice, their young cousin, flitted about, her hands twisting the fringe of her blue shawl, her laughter too bright, her glances too fleeting. Other relations' aunts with pinched faces, cousins with forced jollity filled the room, each carrying the weight of old grudges and unspoken expectations. Miss Marple, her needles clicking rhythmically, observed them all. She noted Clara's imperious tilt of the head, so like Mrs. Eldridge from the village, who ruled her household with similar disdain. Edmund's fidgeting reminded her of young Tommy Pierce, always hiding some small mischief. And poor Beatrice, had the look of a girl caught in a secret, her eyes sliding toward the window as if expecting someone. Miss Marple thoughts drifted to her own youth, to gatherings where smiles masked sharper truths. Families, she mused, were like her knitting, orderly on the surface, but one dropped stitch could unravel everything. Lady Haverford swept into the room, her silver hair gleaming under the chandelier, her voice cutting through the din. My dears, tonight we shall display the cameo pendant our family's pride, passed down from Sir Reginald himself. The room stilled, all eyes turning to her. The pendant, a century-old treasure of carved sardonyx set in gold, was rumoured to be worth a small fortune, though its true value lay in its history. Sir Reginald, a dashing figure in family lore, had won it in a due law, so the story went. Lady Haverford's announcement stirred murmurs of excitement, though Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in Beatrice's face, a tightening of Clara's lips. Dinner was a grand affair, with silver gleaming on the long mahogany table and the scent of roast pheasant heavy in the air. Miss Marple, seated between a garrulous aunt and a taciturn cousin, listened more than she spoke, her mild demeanour belying the sharpness of her mind. Clara complained about the estate's upkeep, hinting at financial strain. Edmund, pushing peas around his plate, mentioned a rare manuscript he'd uncovered in the library, his voice low but fervent. Beatrice, opposite Miss Marple, spilled her wine and laughed too loudly, drawing a frown from Lady Haverford. The talk turned to absent family members, notably Lionel, Lady Haverford's nephew, who was reportedly travelling in Italy. Such a charming boy, Lady Haverford said, but so restless. Miss Marple noted the absence of warmth in her tone. As dessert was served plum tart with clotted creamer. Footman approached Lady Haverford, his face ashen. He whispered urgently, and her fork clattered to the plate. She rose, her composure fraying, and beckoned the family to the library. Miss Marple followed, her steps slow but deliberate, her knitting bag slung over her arm. In the library, a velvet-lined case sat open on a polished table, its emptiness stark under the lamplight. The cameo pendant was gone. A gasp rippled through the gathered family. Lady Haverford, her hand at her throat, declared, "I checked it just before dinner. It was here." Clara's eyes flashed with accusation, scanning the servants who lingered at the door. Edmund muttered about locked windows, his voice barely audible. Beatrice clutched her shawl, her face pale, her fingers trembling. The other guests whispered theories: burglars, perhaps, or a careless maid. Miss Marple, standing quietly by a bookcase, noticed a tiny scrap of blue silk caught on the case's edge, its sheen catching the light. She said nothing, but her eyes gleamed with interest. As the family's voices rose in a clamour of blame and bewilderment, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to her neighbour, Mrs. Clement, whose lost brooch had revealed a household secrets. Manor, she sensed, held its own truths, waiting to be unravelled. She settled into a chair, her knitting resumed, and prepared to watch and listen and see. Chapter 2. The empty case. The library of Maplecroft Manor, with its towering bookshelves and heavy damasked curtains, seemed to hold its breath as the Haverford family gathered around the empty velvet case. The air, thick with the scent of old leather and wax polish, carried a chill that had little to do with the autumn night beyond the leaded windows. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, her knitting needles clicking softly, observed the scene with her customary quiet intensity. The cameo pendant's disappearance had cast a pall over the reunion, transforming the evening's joviality into a tableau of suspicion and unease. Lady Haverford stood by the mahogany table, her hands clasped tightly, her face a mask of controlled distress. The velvet-lined case, its lid flung open, lay before her like an accusation. "I placed the pendant here myself," she said, her voice steady but edged with strain. "Just before we went in to dinner, I checked it. The lock was secure, the room empty. How could it be gone?" Her eyes, sharp and searching, swept over the assembled family, lingering on each face as if seeking a confession. Clara Haverford, her lips pursed, stepped forward, her silk dress rustling with purpose. "It's obvious, isn't it? One of the servants must have taken it. They're always poking about where they shouldn't." Her tone, imperious and cutting, reminded Miss Marple of Mrs. Price Ridley, the St. Mary Mead busybody who never hesitated to cast blame. Clara's accusation drew murmurs from the cousins, some nodding, others shifting uncomfortably. The servants clustered near the door under the watchful eye of the butler. Mr. Grayson stiffened but remained silent. Edmund, standing by a bookshelf, his fingers tracing the spine of a worn volume, shook his head. "Nonsense, Clara. The servants have been with us for years. Why would they risk their positions now?" His voice, though soft, carried a note of defiance, and Miss Marple noted the faint flush on his cheeks. He glanced toward the windows, as if expecting to see a shadowy figure retreating into the night. "It's more likely an outsider, someone who knew the pendant would be shown tonight." Beatrice, hovering near the back of the room, clutched her blue shawl tightly, her knuckles white. "An outsider," she echoed, her voice trembling. But the doors were locked, weren't they? And the windows? She trailed off, her eyes darting to the heavy curtains that concealed the tall casements. Miss Marple, watching her closely, recalled young Elsie Tanner from the village, whose nervous habits always betrayed a secret. Beatrice's agitation, she thought, was more than mere shock. Lady Haverford raised a hand for silence. Enough speculation. We must act. Mr. Grayson, fetch Constable Dobbs at once. He'll know what to do. The butler nodded and departed, his footsteps echoing in the hall. The family dispersed into small knots, whispering theories, while Miss Marple remained in her chair, her eyes fixed on the empty case. A tiny scrap of blue silk, caught on the case's gilded edge, gleamed faintly in the lamplight. She leaned forward, her movements slow and deliberate, and examined it without touching. The silk was fine, almost translucent, with a delicate sheen that suggested expense. It was not, she thought, the sort of thing one might find on a servant's apron. Her mind wandered to a long-ago incident at St. Mary Mead's vicarage, where a misplaced handkerchief had unravelled a theft. Small things, she knew, often spoke louder than grand gestures. She tucked the observation away, her needles resuming their rhythm, and turned her attention to the family. Clara was now interrogating a young maid, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Edmund had retreated to a corner, his book forgotten, his gaze fixed on the floor. Beatrice, meanwhile, had slipped closer to the case, her fingers brushing the table as if drawn to the empty space. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Beatrice's shawl, she noted, was of a similar blue, though no ribbon adorned it now. The arrival of Constable Dobbs broke the tension, his heavy boots thudding on the polished floor. A stout man with a walrus moustache, he carried an air of self-important efficiency that Miss Marple found faintly amusing. She had known many constables. In her time, and most, she thought, overestimated their own cleverness. Dobbs surveyed the room, his notebook in hand, and began questioning Lady Haverford with a ponderous formality. "Now, your ladyship, let's have the facts. When did you last see this pendant? Who had access to the library?" Lady Haverford recounted her movements with precision. She had unlocked the case at 5 o'clock, placed the pendant inside, and locked it again. She had then joined the family in the drawing room, leaving the library unattended. The key, she explained, remained in her possession, tucked into a small reticule she carried. Dobbs examined the case, his thick fingers probing the lock. "No signs of tampering," he muttered, though Miss Marple, from her vantage point, thought his inspection cursory. She made a mental note to examine the lock herself later. When the room was less crowded, Dobbs turned to the family, his questions blunt and repetitive. "Did anyone enter the library after her ladyship? Speak up, now." The cousins shook their heads, their denials overlapping. Clara insisted the servants be searched, a suggestion Dobbs seized with enthusiasm, though Mr. Grayson's icy glare suggested such a measure would be fruitless. Edmund, roused from his reverie, proposed checking the windows for signs of forced entry. Beatrice, when questioned, stammered that she had been in the drawing-room all evening, a claim corroborated by a talkative aunt who had monopolized her attention. Miss Marple, saying little, listened intently. She noted the inconsistencies in their stories, not lies perhaps, but omissions. Clara's insistence on the servant's guilt seemed fervent, as if deflecting attention. Edmund's suggestion about the windows, while sensible, carried a hint of distraction, as if he wished to steer Dobbs elsewhere, and Beatrice could scarcely meet the constable's eyes. her fingers twisting the fringe of her shawl until Miss Marple feared it would tear. As Dobbs droned on, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the pendant itself. A cameo, Lady Haverford had said, carved with a profile of a woman, set in gold filigree. Its value was not merely monetary, but sentimental, a link to the Haverford lineage. She recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen locket had revealed a family's hidden resentments. The pendant's disappearance, she suspected, was no random theft, but a deliberate act, tied to the currents of envy or desperation that ran beneath the family's polished surface. The constable, concluding his initial inquiries, announced he would return in the morning with a proper search plan. "No one leaves the manor tonight," he declared, as if addressing a gang of conspirators rather than a genteel family. Guests dispersed, their murmurs trailing into the hall, leaving Miss Marple alone with Lady Haverford and the empty case. The older woman sank into a chair, her composure fraying. "Jane, what am I to do? That pendant, it's all we have of Sir Reginald's legacy." Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose, her movements slow but purposeful. "My dear, we shall find it. People are careless, you know, even thieves. They leave traces." She approached the case, her eyes sharp despite the dim light. The lock, as Dobbs had said, showed no obvious damage, but a faint scratch marred its brass surface, barely visible unless one looked closely. The blue silk scrap, still caught on the edge, seemed to mock the case's emptiness. Miss Marple resisted the urge to touch it, knowing Dobbs would likely dismiss it as insignificant. Lady Haverford watched her, a glimmer of hope in her tired eyes. "You see something, don't you, Jane? You always do." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind already weaving connections. The silk, the scratch, the family's unease, were threads in a pattern, not yet clear but forming. She thought of her friend Dolly Bantry, whose knack for stumbling into mysteries had taught her the value of patience. "Let us sleep on it," she said gently. "Morning often brings clarity." As they left the library, Miss Marple glanced back at the case, its velvet interior a silent challenge. She thought of Lionel, the absent nephew, whose name had hovered over the evening like a spectre. His debts, whispered about in the village, were no secret to her keen ears. Could he have returned, unseen, to claim the pendant? The idea lingered, as persistent as the click of her needles, which resumed as she made her way to her room, in the quiet of her guest chamber. Miss Marple sat by the window, the manor's darkened grounds stretching before her. The night was still, save for the rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. She opened her knitting bag, her fingers brushing a small notebook where she jotted her observations. "The blue silk," she wrote, "matches Beatrice's shawl. The locks scratch recent. Lionel's absence too convenient." She closed the notebook, her mind alive with possibilities. Families, she knew, were like villagers, full of secrets, waiting for a patient eye to uncover them. The manor slept, but Miss Marple did not. Her thoughts turned to the morning when she would walk the grounds, seeking the traces that thieves, in their haste, so often left behind. The cameo pendant, she felt certain, was still within Maplecroft's walls, hidden not by cunning but by desperation, and she, with her quiet ways and sharp eyes, would find it. Chapter 3. Footprints in the Duther morning mist clung to the grounds of Maplecroft Manor, softening the edges of its ancient use and shrouding the rose garden in a delicate veil. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a woolen shawl against the October chill, stepped onto the terrace with her usual unhurried grace, her eyes bright with purpose. The house behind her was still, its occupants either sleeping off the previous night's turmoil or nursing private anxieties in their rooms. The theft of the cameo pendant had stirred the Haverford family like a stone tossed into a still pond, and Miss Marple, ever attuned to the ripples, intended to follow them. She had risen early, as was her habit, her mind already turning over. The events of the previous evening, the empty velvet case, the scrap of blue silk, the faint scratch on the lock, these were clues, small but insistent, like the misplaced buttons in her neighbour Mrs. Clement's sewing basket, which had once revealed a servant's pilfering. Miss Marple knew that mysteries, like knitting, required patience to untangle. She had declined breakfast in the dining room, citing a desire for fresh air, and now she stood on the terrace, her gaze sweeping the manicured lawns that stretched toward the conservatory. Beatrice, the young cousin whose nervous demeanour had caught Miss Marple's attention, appeared at the terrace door, her blue shawl draped loosely over her shoulders. "Miss Marple, you're up early," she said, her voice bright but strained, as if she had rehearsed the words. "I thought I might join you for a walk. The house feels stifling." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes gentle but probing. "A walk would be lovely, my dear. The morning air does wonders for clarity." She noted Beatrice's flushed cheeks and the way her fingers twisted the shawl's fringe, much as they had the night before. The girl's agitation, she thought, was not merely the shock of the theft, but something deeper, like young Mary Pritchard, from St. Mary Mead, who had fidgeted just so when hiding her sweetheart's letters. They descended the stone steps to the lawn, the grass damp with dew that sparkled in the weak sunlight. Miss Marple moved slowly, her stick tapping the ground, though her eyes were sharp, scanning the terrain. As they neared the conservatory, a glass-walled structure filled with exotic blooms, she paused, her gaze dropping to the ground. There, in the soft earth beneath the yews, was a trail of footprints, clear and unmistakable. They were large, unmistakably a man's, with a deep imprint that suggested weight and haste. The prints led from the lawn to the conservatory's side door, then vanished on the flagstone path. "Curious," Miss Marple murmured, bending slightly to examine them. "These are fresh, made since the dew fell last night. A solitary walker, it seems, in a house full of guests." She straightened, her expression mild but her mind racing. The prints were too large for Edmund, whose slight frame suggested smaller feet, and too deliberate for a casual stroll. She thought of Lionel, the absent nephew, whose rumoured debts had reached even St. Mary Mead's gossip circles. Could he have returned, slipping through the night to claim the pendant? Beatrice, following her gaze, flushed a deeper red. Footprints? Oh, they could be anyone's. Perhaps a gardener. Her voice was too quick, her eyes avoiding the tracks. Miss Marple noted her discomfort, much as she had once noted young Tommy Pierce's stammer when questioned about a missing pie. "Perhaps," she said lightly, "but gardeners rarely work at night, and these prints are quite distinct." They continued their walk, Miss Marple steering them toward the conservatory door. The glass panes gleamed, reflecting the mist, but the door itself, heavy oak frame with a single lock, drew her attention. She paused, her fingers brushing the handle, and noticed a faint smudge of mud on the threshold, barely visible against the dark wood. The lock, too, bore a subtle scratch, not unlike the one on the library's velvet case. "This door," she said, as if to herself, "seems to have had a visitor." Beatrice's hands tightened on her shawl. A visitor? But who would come here? The conservatory's locked at night. Her words tumbled out, too fast, and Miss Marple's eyes softened with understanding. The girl knew something, or suspected it, and her silence was a choice. Miss Marple thought of her friend Dolly Bantry, whose tactful silences had often coaxed confessions from reluctant lips. She said nothing more, merely nodding, and suggested they return to the house. Inside, the breakfast room was a scene of strained civility. Clara Haverford, presiding over the silver teapot, was expounding on the incompetence of Constable Dobbs, who had promised to return by noon. "He'll traipse about, upsetting everyone, and find nothing," she declared, her voice sharp as a knife's edge. Edmund, picking at a piece of toast, muttered agreement, though his eyes remained fixed on his plate. Lady Haverford, at the head of the table, looked weary, her usual vivacity dimmed by the theft. The other cousins, aunts with pinched lips, a uncle with a booming laugh offered theories ranging from gypsies to disgruntled tenants, each more fanciful than the last. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, listened with her usual quiet attention. She noted Clara's insistence on external culprits, as if to deflect scrutiny from the family. Edmund's silence, broken only by occasional murmurs, suggested preoccupation, perhaps guilt, and Beatrice, who had slipped into a chair beside her, ate nothing, her fingers shredding a napkin into tiny pieces. Miss Marple thought of her niece Joan's nervous habits when faced with difficult truths. The family, she sensed, was a tapestry of secrets, each thread pulling at the others. As breakfast ended, Miss Marple excused herself, citing a need to rest, though her true intention was to revisit the library. The room, bathed in morning light, felt less oppressive than the previous night, but the empty velvet case still dominated the scene. She approached it, her movements slow, and examined the lock again. The scratch she had noticed was indeed recent, its edges bright against the brass. The blue silk scrap, still caught on the case's edge, seemed to mock her with its presence. She resisted the urge to remove it, knowing Dobbs would likely overlook it, but she memorized its texture and sheen, comparing it mentally to Beatrice. Her thoughts turned to the conservatory footprints. They suggested an intruder, or someone posing as one, and their proximity to the side door hinted at a planned entry. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a gardener's muddy boots had betrayed a midnight rendezvous. The mud on the conservatory threshold, though faint, was a clue of similar weight. She resolved to speak to the servants, whose observations often outstripped those of their masters. In the servants' hall, she found Elsie, a young maid with a quick smile and sharper eyes. Over a cup of tea, Miss Marple gently probed, "You must see so much, Elsie, moving about the house. Did you notice anything odd last evening, near the conservatory, perhaps?" Elsie hesitated, glancing at the door, then leaned closer. "I did see a shadow, miss, just at dusk. A man, I thought, in a dark coat, moving quick-like near the conservatory. I took it for Mr. Edmund, but now I'm not sure. It was too tall, too fast." Miss Marple nodded, her expression encouraging. "And this shadow, did it enter the house?" Elsie shook her head. "Not that I saw, miss. I was called to the kitchen then. But it gave me a turn, it did." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind alight with possibilities. A tall man, in a dark coat, moving with purpose. Lionel Haverford, she recalled, was tall and lanky, with a gambler's restless energy. His absence, so carefully noted by the family, seemed less certain by the minute. Returning to the drawing-room, Miss Marple found Lady Haverford alone, sorting through a pile of letters. "Jane, you've been sleuthing, haven't you?" the older woman said, a faint smile breaking through her fatigue. "I know that look." Miss Marple chuckled, settling into a chair. Merely observing, my dear. People are so careless with their secrets. She steered the conversation to Lionel, mentioning his travels with a casual air. Such a pity he missed the reunion. Has he ridden lately? Lady Haverford's smile faded. A letter came last week from Florence. He's been delayed, he says, by some business matter. She produced the letter, its envelope creased but intact, and handed it to Miss Marple. The postmark was indeed Florence, dated 8 days prior, and the handwriting was bold, with a flourish that suggested confidence. Yet something in the scripture, slight tremor in the loop, struck Miss Marple as odd, like the forged signatures she had once uncovered in a village charity scam. She returned the letter, her mind turning to the footprints and the mud-smudged door. Lionel's absence, she suspected, was a fiction maintained to divert suspicion. The family's reactions to his name, Clara's scorn, Edmund's unease, Beatrice's silence suggested they knew, or feared, more than they admitted. Miss Marple thought of her friend Mrs. Bantry, whose knack for sensing deceit had often guided her own inquiries. The Haverfords, she felt certain, were guarding a truth, and the footprints were its first trace. As noon approached, Constable Dobbs returned, his notebook bristling with self-importance. He announced a thorough search of the grounds, though his plan seemed more bluster than strategy. Miss Marple, declining to join the bustle, remained in the drawing-room, her knitting a pretext for observation. She watched Beatrice, who lingered by the window, her eyes fixed on the conservatory. The girl's shawl, she noted, was absent today, replaced by a plain scarf. A precaution, perhaps, or an admission. The morning wore on the manor humming with tension. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the footprints, the mud, the silk. They were fragments, but fragments, she knew, could build a picture, like her. Knitting, where a single dropped stitch could unravel a pattern, these clues would lead her to the truth. She settled deeper into her chair, her needles clicking, and waited for the next thread to appear. Chapter 4. The Nephew's Shadow. The pale light of late morning filtered through the tall windows of Maplecroft Manor, casting long shadows across the polished floors. The house, though grand, seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls sensed the unease that had settled over its occupants since the cameo pendant's theft. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a corner of the morning room with her knitting in her lap, observed the Haverford family with her characteristic quiet intensity. The footprints by the conservatory, the smudge of mud on the threshold, and the scrap of blue silk in the library had woven themselves into a pattern in her mind, incomplete but tantalizing, like the intricate lace she once attempted in her youth. Each clue required careful handling to avoid a tangle. The morning room, with its chintz, curtains and delicate porcelain, was a hub of subdued activity. Clara Haverford, her sharp features drawn tighter than usual, was dictating a letter to a secretary, her voice clipped as she demanded stricter oversight of the servants. Edmund, hunched over a notebook at a small writing desk, scribbled furiously, his pen scratching like a restless insect. Beatrice, seated near the fireplace, stared into the flames, her hands idle for once, her usual nervous energy replaced by a stillness that Miss Marple found more telling than any fidgeting. The other relatives' cousins and aunts, with varying degrees of involvement, drifted in and out, their conversations a low hum of speculation about the theft. Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, steered her thoughts to Lionel Haverford, the absent nephew whose name had surfaced repeatedly in the village gossip she so diligently absorbed. His debts, whispered about in St. Mary Mead's tie rooms, painted a picture of a young man driven to desperate measures. The footprints by the conservatory, large and purposeful, suggested a man's presence, and the scratched lock on the door hinted at stealth. Could Lionel have slipped back to Maplecroft, unseen, to claim the pendant? The idea, though unproven, clung to her mind like a burr, persistent and sharp. She rose, her movements slow but deliberate, and excused herself to join Lady Haverford for luncheon in the dining room. The table, set with gleaming silver and crisp linen, was a stark contrast to the family's frayed nerves. Lady Haverford, seated at the head, managed a wan smile as she greeted her guest. "Jane, you're a comfort in this dreadful business," she said, though her eyes betrayed exhaustion. "Constable Dobbs is poking about the grounds again, but I fear he's more noise than sense." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. "He means well, my dear, but men like Dobbs often miss the small things." She took her seat, her eyes drifting to the family as they gathered. Clara, her posture rigid, complained about the delay in the investigation, her words slicing through the air like a blade. Edmund, pushing a slice of cold ham around his plate, seemed lost in thought, his fingers stained with ink. Beatrice, pale and silent, avoided the gaze of her aunt, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the absence of Beatrice's blue shawl, replaced by a plain grey scarf that seemed chosen for its anonymity. As the meal progressed, Miss Marple deftly turned the conversation to Lionel, her tone light and casual. "It's such a pity your nephew couldn't join us," she remarked, her eyes on Lady Haverford. "He's still in Italy, I presume. So fond of travel, I hear." The effect was immediate, though subtle. Clara's fork paused mid-air, her lips thinning. Edmund's head jerked up, his eyes darting to his mother. Beatrice, stirring her soup, spilled a drop, her hand trembling. Lady Haverford, however, answered smoothly, her voice tinged with affection. "Oh, Lionel's always been a wanderer. His last letter came from Florence, full of talk about art and ruins. He's quite taken with the place." Miss Marple smiled, her mind noting the family's reactions. Clara's scorn, she thought, was too pronounced, as if masking a deeper resentment. Edmund's unease suggested knowledge he preferred to keep hidden. And Beatrice seemed on the verge of confession, her silence louder than words. Miss Marple recalled her friend Mrs. Bantry's tales of family quarrels, where silences often spoke of loyalty or fear. Lionel's absence, she suspected, was a fiction, carefully maintained to shield him or someone else. After luncheon, Miss Marple proposed a stroll to the conservatory, ostensibly to admire the orchids, but in truth to revisit the footprints. Beatrice, perhaps sensing an opportunity to escape the dining room's tension, offered to accompany her. They crossed the lawn, the grass still damp from the morning's mist, and approached the glass-walled structure. The footprints, though fainter now, were still visible, their deep imprints leading to the side door. Miss Marple paused, her stick tapping the ground, and studied the lock again. The scratch she had noted earlier was more pronounced in the daylight. A thin gouge that suggested a tool rather than a key. The mud smudge on the threshold, though dry, remained, its texture distinct from the garden's loamy soil. Someone was in a hurry, Miss Marple murmured, her voice soft but pointed. This door, I think, was their way in or out. Beatrice, standing beside her, shifted uncomfortably, her scarf slipping slightly to reveal a nervous flush at her throat. "It could have been anyone," she said, her words rushed. "A poacher, perhaps, or a tramp." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with gentle skepticism. "Perhaps, my dear, but tramps rarely leave such purposeful tracks, and poachers seldom tamper with locks." They entered the conservatory, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. The glass walls, streaked with condensation, reflected the grey sky outside. Miss Marple moved slowly among the plants, her eyes scanning the floor for further clues. Near a cluster of ferns, she spotted a tiny speck of mud, similar to that on the threshold, caught in the grout between the tiles. It was a small thing, but small things, she knew, were often the key. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a single leaf had betrayed a thief's path through a garden. "This mud," she said, almost to herself, "is from the path. Beyond the use, not the lawn, someone came from the woods." Beatrice's breath caught, a sound so faint Miss Marple might have missed it had she not been listening. The girl's hands twisted her scarf, and her eyes darted to the door. "The woods," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "But why would anyone come from there?" Miss Marple did not answer, merely smiling as she bent to examine a nearby orchid. Beatrice, she thought, was like young Annie Webb, who had once concealed her brother's misdeeds out of misplaced loyalty. The girl knew something, and her silence was a thread Miss Marple intended to follow. Back in the house, the afternoon brought a flurry of activity as Constable Dobbs returned, his face red from tramping the grounds. He gathered the family in the library, his notebook bristling with self-important scribbles. "We've searched the gardens and the outbuildings," he announced, his voice booming. "No sign of the pendant, but I've got my eye on those servants. One of M's, bound to know something." Clara nodded vigorously, her earlier accusations echoed in her tight smile. Edmund, seated by the window, muttered about the futility of searching without a plan. Beatrice, standing near the empty velvet case, seemed to shrink into herself, her eyes fixed on the floor. Miss Marple, knitting quietly in a corner, listened as Dobbs questioned the family again, his queries as blunt as a hammer. He asked about visitors, deliveries, and strangers seen near the manor, but the answers were vague, tinged with irritation. Clara insisted the servants be interrogated further, while Edmund suggested checking the village for suspicious characters. Beatrice, when pressed, repeated her claim of staying in the drawing-room all evening, her voice trembling but firm. Miss Marple noted the repetition, so like the rehearsed denials of a village boy caught stealing apples. As Dobbs droned on, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Lionel. His letter from Florence, so conveniently timed, nagged at her. She recalled her postmistress friend, Miss Hartnell, who had once spotted a forged postmark in a matter of unpaid debts. The letter's handwriting, she suspected, might hold a clue, but she would need to see it again. More pressing were the footprints and the mud, which pointed to a deliberate entry through the conservatory. Lionel, she reasoned, could have slipped into the manor unnoticed, using the woods to conceal his approach. His debts, she knew from village gossip, were substantial, and the pendant's value would be a powerful temptation. The library session ended with Dobbs promising to interview the servants again, a prospect that drew a sigh from Lady Haverford. As the family dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the velvet case. The blue silk scrap, still caught on its edge, seemed to beckon her. She approached, her movements slow, and studied it closely. The silk was finer than she had first thought, with a subtle embroidery that matched nothing in Beatrice's wardrobe. Could it belong to someone else, or had it been planted to mislead? She thought of her friend Mrs. Bantry's lost earring, which had been found in a maid's apron to cast suspicion. The silk, she decided, was a clue to be handled with care. As evening approached, Miss Marple joined Lady Haverford for tea in the morning room, where the older woman confided her fears. "Jane, this theft feels personal, as if someone meant to wound us." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes gentle but sharp. "People often act out of need, my dear, or fear. The pendant is more than gold, it's a symbol." She sipped her tea, her mind turning to Lionel's shadow, which seemed to loom over the manor. The footprints, the mud, the silk, they were pieces of a puzzle, and she was determined to fit them together. The afternoon faded into dusk, the manor settling into an uneasy quiet. Miss Marple, retiring to her room, opened her notebook and jotted her observations. Footprints man's recent, from woods. Mud on threshold matches path. Silk scrap knot, Beatrice's Lionel's letter-check handwriting. She closed the book, her needles resuming their rhythm, and gazed out at the darkening grounds. The truth, she knew, was close, hidden in the small things that others overlooked. Like her knitting, it required only patience to reveal its pattern. Chapter 5. A Portrait Secret. The late afternoon sun slanted through the high windows of Maplecroft Manor, gilding the dust motes that danced in the air of the portrait gallery. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl neatly folded over her arm, moved, with quiet purpose, along the row of sombre Haverford ancestors, their painted eyes following her with an air of silent judgment. The theft of the cameo pendant had cast a shadow over the manor, and the clue's footprints by the conservatory, a smudge of mud, a scrap of blue silk, had begun to weave a delicate pattern in her mind, not unlike the intricate shawls she knitted. For the church bazaar, each clue, she knew, was a stitch that, if followed, might unravel the truth. The portrait gallery, with its polished oak floor and faded tapestries, was a place of stillness, its silence broken only by the faint creak of the manor settling into the evening. Miss Marple had chosen this hour, when the family was occupied with tea or private anxieties, to explore its secrets. The footprints and the scratched lock on the conservatory door pointed to an intruder with intimate knowledge of the manor, and her thoughts kept returning to Lionel Haverford, the absent nephew whose financial troubles were whispered about in St. Mary Mead's quiet corners. The blue silk, however, remained an enigmatis fine. We've suggested a garment of quality, yet it did not match Beatrice's shawl. Despite her nervous demeanour, Miss Marple paused before a portrait of Lady Eleanor Haverford, Sir Reginald's sister, whose serene expression belied the turbulent family history recorded in old letters. The painting, set in a heavy gilt frame, hung slightly askew, its lower edge casting a shadow that seemed to conceal something. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a faint irregularity in the panelling behind a hairline crack, barely visible, that suggested more than age. She recalled a long-ago incident in St. Mary Mead, where a misaligned picture had hidden a niche containing a stolen brooch. Her heart quickened, though her face remained placid, as she considered the possibility of a concealed compartment. Edmund, the bookish son, appeared at the gallery's entrance, his spectacles glinting in the dim light. "Miss Marple, are you admiring the family history?" he asked, his voice polite but strained, as if he had been summoned against his will. His hands, stained with ink, clutched a small notebook, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flickered to the portrait, then away. "Indeed, Edmund," she replied, her tone mild. "Lady Eleanor's portrait is quite striking, though it seems a touch off-centre, don't you think?" Edmund hesitated, his fingers tightening on the notebook. "Off-centre? I hadn't noticed." His voice was too quick, and Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with gentle scrutiny. She recalled young Tommy Pierce, whose hasty denials had once betrayed a pilfered jam tart. "Perhaps you could help me adjust it," she suggested, her voice as soft as her knitting wool. "My old hands aren't what they used to be." Reluctantly, Edmund stepped forward, his movements awkward. Together, they grasped the frame, its weight surprising for its size. As they tilted it, a soft click sounded, and a section of the paneling behind swung inward, revealing a small, brass-bound safe embedded in the wall. Edmund started, his spectacles slipping down his nose, and Miss Marple noted his genuine surprise, though his quick glance toward the door suggested unease. "Good heavens," she said, her tone one of mild astonishment. "What have we here?" Edmund peered at the safe, his scholarly curiosity battling his evident discomfort. "A safe? I've never seen it before. Mother must know about this." His voice trembled slightly, and Miss Marple wondered if his ignorance was as complete as he claimed. The safe was old, its surface pitted with age, but its lock gleamed, as if recently polished. A faint scratch marked the dial, not unlike the one on the conservatory door, and Miss Marple's mind raced. Had the pendant been hidden here before its theft, or was the safe the true target? "We must inform Lady Haverford," Miss Marple said, her tone firm but gentle. Edmund nodded, his hands shaking as he adjusted his spectacles, and hurried off to fetch his mother. Miss Marple remained, her eyes fixed on the safe. Its discovery, she thought, was no accident, it was a clue to the thief's intentions. She recalled her friend Dolly Bantry's discovery of a hidden cupboard that had revealed a family's greed. Hidden places, she knew, were often the key to hidden motives. Lady Haverford arrived, her face pale but composed, accompanied by Clara, whose sharp eyes narrowed at the sight of the safe. "Jane, what is this?" Lady Haverford exclaimed, her hands fluttering. "A safe behind Eleanor's portrait. I had no idea." Her surprise seemed genuine, but Miss Marple noted Clara's. Silence, her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's outrageous," Clara said at last, her voice low and cutting. "Who put it there, and what's inside?" Her questions were more accusation than inquiry, and Miss Marple observed the way her hands clenched, as if restraining a deeper anger. Edmund, standing back, shifted uneasily, his notebook now tucked under his arm. "It must be old," he muttered. "From Sir Reginald's time, perhaps." His suggestion was tentative, but Miss Marple seized it, her voice thoughtful. "Perhaps, Edmund. People often hide their treasures in such places. My neighbour, Mrs. Clement, once found a locket in a wall niche, quite by chance." She watched his reaction, noting the faint flush on his cheeks. Did he know more than he let on, or was his unease merely the weight of the moment? Lady Haverford approached the safe, her fingers brushing the dial. "We must open it," she said, though her voice wavered. "But the combination, how would we know it?" Miss Marple suggested trying a significant date, perhaps Lady Eleanor's birth year, which Lady Haverford recalled as 1845. The dial turned smoothly but yielded nothing, the safe remaining locked. Clara's impatience flared. "This is ridiculous. We need a locksmith, or we'll be here all day." Her tone, sharp as a St. Mary Mead gossip's tongue, suggested more than frustration, fear, perhaps, of what the safe might reveal. Miss Marple stepped back, her eyes scanning the panelling around the safe. A faint smudge, barely visible, marked the wood near the hinge, as if a finger had brushed it in haste. It was a small thing, but small things, she knew, were often the key. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead where a smudged mirror had betrayed a thief's carelessness. "We should be patient," she said, her tone soothing. Secrets like this require time to unravel. As the family debated what to do, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Lionel. His absence, so carefully noted by the family, seemed increasingly suspect. The footprints by the conservatory, the mud, the scratched lock all pointed to someone familiar with the manor's hidden corners. Could Lionel have known of the safe, perhaps from old family records or childhood explorations? His debts, she recalled, were a heavy burden, and the pendant's value would be a siren call to a desperate man. The family dispersed, Lady Haverford promising to search the estate's archives for clues to the combination. Clara stormed off, muttering about incompetence, while Edmund lingered, his eyes on the portrait as if it held answers he feared to seek. Miss Marple, returning to the morning room, found Beatrice there, alone, her hands twisting a handkerchief. The girl's grey scarf was gone, replaced by a simple blouse, and Miss Marple noted the absence of the blue shawl that had so intrigued her. "Beatrice, my dear," she said gently, "you seem troubled. Is there something you'd like to share?" Beatrice's eyes widened, her hands stilling. "No, Miss Marple, I'm just upset about the pendant." Her voice was too high, her denial too swift, and Miss Marple recalled young Annie Webb, whose lies had crumbled under gentle questioning. She did not press, merely nodding, but her mind filed away the girl's unease. Beatrice, she suspected, knew something, perhaps not the theft itself, but a piece of the puzzle. In the library, Miss Marple revisited the velvet case, its emptiness a silent challenge. The blue silk scrap, still caught on its edge, seemed to taunt her. She examined it closely, noting its fine weave and the absence of embroidery, which ruled out her earlier suspicion of a connection to another garment. Had it been torn from the thief's clothing in haste, or placed there to mislead? She thought of a St. Mary Mead incident, where a stray thread had led to a tailor's shop and a confession. The silk, she decided, was a clue to pursue, though. Its significance remained elusive. Constable Dobbs arrived in the evening, his face flushed from another fruitless search of the grounds. He inspected the safe with a skeptical eye, declaring it a complication and promising to bring a locksmith the next day. His questions to the family were as blunt as ever, focusing on strangers seen near the manor, but the answers were vague, tinged with irritation. Clara insisted the servants be searched again, a demand that drew a frosty response from Mr. Grayson. Edmund suggested checking the attics for old records, a proposal Miss Marple found curiously specific. Beatrice, when questioned, repeated her alibi with a mechanical air, her hands trembling. As night fell, Miss Marple sat by her bedroom window, her notebook open. She jotted her observations. Safe behind Lady Eleanor's portrait smudge on panelling. Silk scrap, no embroidery, not Beatrice's. Edmund's, Uni's knows of safe. Lionel's knowledge, family records. The clues were mounting, each one a thread in the pattern she was weaving. The safe, she suspected, was central, its discovery a turning point in the mystery. Lionel's shadow loomed larger, his absence a carefully crafted illusion. She closed her notebook, her needles clicking softly, and gazed out at the darkened grounds. The truth, she knew, was near, waiting for her to knit its final stitches. Chapter 6. The ribbon's tail, the evening shadows lengthened across Maplecroft Manor, cloaking its ancient halls in a hush that seemed to amplify every creak and whisper. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the drawing-room fire, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the crackling logs, watched the Haverford family with eyes that missed nothing. The discovery of the hidden safe behind Lady Eleanor's portrait had stirred the household like a gust through autumn leaves, and the clue's footprints by the conservatory, a smudge of mud, a scrap of blue silk, were weaving a pattern in her mind, delicate yet persistent, like the intricate scarves she crafted for charity sales. The silk scrap, in particular, nagged at her. Its fine weave a silent question mark in the mystery of the stolen cameo pendant. The drawing room was a scene of strained civility. The family gathered for an early evening tea that felt more like a council of war. Lady Haverford, her silver hair catching the firelight, presided over the silver teapot with a weary grace, her usual vivacity dimmed by the weight of the theft. Clara, her daughter, sat ramrod straight, her sharp eyes scanning the room as if seeking a culprit among the teacups. Edmund, hunched over a book he did not read, fidgeted with his spectacles, his scholarly calm fraying at the edges. Beatrice, perched on the edge of a settee, clutched a handkerchief, her face pale and her eyes darting to the door with every sound from the hall. The other relatives' aunts, with pursed lips, cousins with forced smiles, murmured about the safe, their theories a blend of suspicion and speculation. Miss Marple, her needles clicking rhythmically, turned her attention to the blue silk scrap she had seen on the velvet case in the library. Its fine texture and lack of embroidery had ruled out a connection to Beatrice's shawl, but its presence suggested something deliberater, clue left in haste or planted to mislead. She recalled a St. Mary Mead incident where a stray ribbon had led to a seamstress's confession of petty theft. Could this silk belong to the thief, torn in the act, or was it a red herring, like the misplaced glove that had once thrown suspicion on an innocent maid? Her thoughts drifted to Lionel Haverford, the absent nephew, whose debts and rumoured return loomed large in her calculations. Determined to unravel the silk's tale, Miss Marple excused herself after tea, citing a need to rest, though her true intention was to revisit the library. The room, bathed in the soft glow of a single lamp, felt heavy with secrets, its bookshelves looming like silent witnesses. The velvet case, still on the mahogany table, seemed to mock her with its emptiness. She approached it, her movements slow but purposeful, and examined the blue silk scrap again. It was caught tightly on the case's gilded edge, as if snagged in a struggle. The fabric was delicate, almost translucent, with a sheen that spoke of quality, but its edges were frayed, suggesting it had been torn rather than cut. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A garment, perhaps, caught in a moment of haste, or a deliberate clue, meant to point her in the wrong direction. She thought of her friend Mrs. Bantry, whose knack for noticing small details had once solved a mystery over a lost brooch. People are careless, Dolly, she had said, even when they think they're clever. The silk, she decided, was no accident. It was a thread to follow, but with caution. She made a mental note to ask the servants about any unfamiliar garments seen in the manor, then turned her attention to the case's lock. The faint scratch she had noticed before was more pronounced in the lamplight, a thin gouge that suggested a tool rather than a key. It matched the scratch on the conservatory door, a connection that tightened the web in her mind. As she stood by the case, the door creaked open and Beatrice entered, her face pale and her hands twisting her handkerchief. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect to find you here," she said, her voice trembling. "I couldn't sleep with all this business about the safe." Her eyes darted to the velvet case, then away, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened as if suppressing a confession. "It's troubling, isn't it?" Miss Marple said gently, her tone inviting trust. "This silk, For instance, such a curious thing to find. It reminds me of a ribbon I once saw in St. Mary Mead, caught on a gate that led to quite a story. Beatrice's breath caught, and she stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the silk. A ribbon. I don't know anything about it, she stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple, her expression kind but probing, held up the scrap, careful not to dislodge it. It's fine silk, my dear, not unlike the shawl you wore yesterday, though perhaps it's from something else, scarf, a dress. Beatrice flushed, her hands trembling. My shawl? No, it can't be. I mean, silk is common enough, isn't it? Her denial was too quick, and Miss Marple recalled young Mary Pritchard, whose nervous denials had betrayed a hidden romance. I suppose it is, Miss Marple said, her tone light, though her eyes missed nothing. But it's odd, don't you think, to find it here, caught on the case, almost as if someone left it in a hurry. Beatrice's face paled further, and she turned away, muttering about needing air. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind turning over the girl's agitation. Beatrice, she suspected, knew more than she admitted, perhaps not the theft itself, but a piece of the puzzle, like a village girl protecting a wayward brother. Determined to pursue the silk's origin, Miss Marple sought out Elsie, the maid who had seen a shadowy figure by the conservatory. She found her in the servants' hall, polishing silver with a diligence that suggested escape from the manor's tension. Elsie, my dear, Miss Marple began, her voice as soothing as a lullaby, you have such sharp eyes. Have you noticed any unusual garments about the house's silk scarf, perhaps, or a dress with a torn hem? Elsie paused, her cloth stilling, and glanced at the door. Well, miss, I did see something odd. Last night, when I was tidying the guest rooms, I found a bit of blue silk caught on a chair in the west wing. I thought it was Miss Beatrice's, but her shawl's plain, no tears. I put it in the mending basket, thinking it might belong to a guest. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. The west wing, that's near the conservatory, isn't it? Elsie nodded, her eyes wide. Yes, miss, just down the corridor. I didn't think much of it till now. Miss Marple thanked her, her mind racing. The west wing, she knew, housed the guest rooms, including those assigned to distant cousins. Could the silk belong to someone staying there, or someone who had slipped in unnoticed? Lionel's name surfaced again, his shadow growing sharper in her thoughts. She made her way to the west wing, her stick tapping softly on the floorboards. The corridor was quiet, its walls lined with faded portraits and heavy drapes. The mending basket, tucked in a corner of the housekeeper's room, yielded a small scrap of blue silk, identical in texture to the one in the library. Miss Marple held it to the light, noting its frayed edge and fine weave. It was no coincidence, she thought, but a link to the thief or a clever attempt to mislead. She recalled a St. Mary Mead case, where a torn lace cuff had pointed to a visitor's guilt. The silk, she decided, was a clue to pursue, though its owner remained elusive. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple found the family still gathered, their conversation a low hum of tension. Clara was interrogating Mr. Grayson about the servants' movements, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Edmund, his book abandoned, stared out the window, his fingers drumming on the armrest. Beatrice, back from her abrupt departure, sat silently, her handkerchief now a shredded mess. Lady Haverford, pouring tea, looked up as Miss Marple entered. "Jane, you've been sleuthing again, haven't you?" she said, a faint smile breaking through her fatigue. I can see it in your eyes. Miss Marple chuckled, settling into a chair. Merely observing, my dear. People leave such interesting traces. She steered the conversation to the Manor's guests, mentioning the West Wing with a casual air. So many cousins here for the reunion, she said. Have any been staying in the West Wing? It's such a charming part of the house. Lady Haverford nodded, listing a few distant relatives. But Miss Marple noted Clara's sudden stillness, Edmund's quick glance at Beatrice. The West Wing, it seemed, held significance beyond its guest rooms. As the evening wore on, Constable Dobbs arrived, his heavy boots announcing his presence. He reported no progress on the safe, the locksmith delayed until morning, and his questions to the servants had yielded nothing new. Clara, exasperated, demanded a search of the West Wing, a suggestion that drew a sharp look from Edmund. The West Wing, he said, his voice tight. Why there? It's just guest rooms. His protest, Miss Marple thought, was too vehement, like a village boy denying a prank before being accused. Beatrice, when questioned, claimed to have avoided the West Wing, her alibi as rehearsed as before. Miss Marple, watching her, recalled her friend Mrs. Bantry's knack for coaxing truths from reluctant lips. The girl's silence, she suspected, was not ignorance but loyalty, perhaps to Lionel, whose absence felt increasingly staged. The silk scrap, the footprints, the safe all pointed to someone with knowledge of the Manor's secrets, and Lionel's childhood explorations, mentioned by Lady Haverford, made him a likely candidate. As night fell, Miss Marple retired to her room, her notebook open on the bedside table. She jotted her observations. Blue silken library and West Wing, torn, not Beatrice's. West Wing guest rooms. Near conservatory. Edmund's protest, hiding something. Lionel's knowledge childhood, explorations. The clues were mounting, each one a stitch in the pattern she was weaving. The silk, she felt certain, was no accident. It was a trace left by someone in haste, or a deliberate misdirection. Lionel's shadow loomed larger, his debts a motive that fit the puzzle. She closed her notebook, her needles clicking softly, and gazed out at the darkened grounds. The truth, she knew, was near, waiting for her to unravel its final threads. Chapter 7. A letter from Florence. The morning light crept through the heavy curtains of Maplecroft Manor, casting a soft glow over the breakfast room where the Haverford family gathered in uneasy silence. The theft of the cameo pendant, now compounded by the discovery of a hidden safe and the enigmatic blue silk scrap, had woven a web of suspicion that tightened with each passing hour. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the table with her knitting bag at her side, sipped her tea and observed the family with her characteristic quiet acuity. The footprints by the conservatory, the smudge of mud, and the silk found in both the library and the West Wing were threads in a pattern, delicate yet insistent, like the intricate lace she had once attempted in her youth. Each clue, she knew, required careful handling to avoid unraveling the truth prematurely. The breakfast room, with its gleaming silver and starched linen, was a stark contrast to the family's strained demeanour. Lady Haverford, at the head of the table, managed a weary smile as she passed the marmalade, though her eyes betrayed the toll of sleepless nights. Clara, her daughter, sat with rigid posture, her sharp tongue momentarily stilled as she scanned a newspaper, though her fingers betrayed her agitation by crumpling its edges. Edmund, picking at a piece of toast, seemed lost in thought, his ink-stained hands suggesting a night spent poring over manuscripts rather than sleeping. Beatrice, pale and silent, avoided eye contact, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the absence of her usual blue shawl replaced by a plain woolen scarf that seemed chosen for its lack of distinction. Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly in her lap, turned her thoughts to the silk scrap, which had become a focal point in her mind. Its presence in both the library and the West Wing suggested a connection to the thief, for a deliberate attempt to mislead. The absence of embroidery ruled out Beatrice's shawl. But it's fine, we've hinted at a garment of quality, perhaps belonging to someone who moved freely through the manor. Her suspicions kept circling back to Lionel Haverford, the absent nephew, whose debts and rumoured return were the talk of St. Mary Mead's gossip circles. The footprints by the conservatory, large and purposeful, and the scratched lock on the door pointed to someone familiar with the manor's secrets. Could Lionel have slipped back, using the West Wing's proximity to the conservatory to enter unnoticed? As the meal progressed, a footman entered, bearing a silver tray with a single letter for you, my lady, he said, presenting it to Lady Haverford. She took it, her brow furrowing as she examined the envelope. Another from Lionel, she announced, her voice tinged with surprise. Postmarked Florence, only yesterday. The room stilled, all eyes turning to her. Clara's lips thinned, Edmund's head jerked up, and Beatrice's teacup clattered against its saucer. Miss Marple, her expression mild, noted their reactions. So like the villagers of St. Mary Mead, when a scandalous rumour surfaced, Lady Haverford opened the letter, her hand steady despite the tension in the air. She read aloud, her voice faltering slightly. My dearest aunt, I hope the reunion brings you joy. My travels in Florence have been delayed by a small matter of business, but I trust all is well at Maplecroft. Your affectionate nephew, Lionel. The words, innocuous on the surface, hung heavily in the room. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, remarked lightly, how remarkable the speed of the post these days. A letter from Florence in a single day. My friend Miss Hartnell, our postmistress, would be quite astonished. Her comment, delivered with a gentle smile, drew a flush from Clara, who snapped, the post is unreliable enough. He probably sent it earlier. Edmund, adjusting his spectacles, muttered agreement, though his eyes avoided the letter. Beatrice, silent, stared at her plate, her fingers twisting her scarf. Miss Marple's mind raced. The postmark, dated yesterday, was suspiciously recent for international mail, and the handwriting, though bold, lacked the flourish she recalled from Lionel's earlier letter. She thought of a St. Mary Mead incident, where a forged letter had nearly deceived the vicar into parting with charity funds. Could this letter be a ruse, mailed locally to maintain the illusion of Lionel's absence? May I see the envelope? My dear, Miss Marple asked, her tone as innocuous as her knitting. Lady Haverford handed it over, and Miss Marple examined it closely. The postmark was indeed Florence, but the ink seemed too fresh, the stamp's edges too crisp. The handwriting, while resembling Lionel's, had a stiffness that suggested imitation, as if traced from a model. She recalled her postmistress friends' tales of tampered envelopes, where a clever hand could mimic a foreign postmark with a local postbox. Very interesting, she murmured, returning the letter. Lionel must be quite devoted to write so often. Her words, light as they were, stirred the family. Clara's eyes flashed with irritation, as if sensing an accusation. Edmund cleared his throat, changing the subject to the weather, while Beatrice's hands trembled, spilling a drop of tea. Miss Marple, her eyes gentle but sharp, noted their unease. The letter, she suspected, was no coincidence. It was a piece of the puzzle, designed to divert suspicion from Lionel's presence. But who had sent it, and why. Determined to pursue the letter's origins, Miss Marple excused herself after breakfast, citing a need for fresh air. She made her way to the village post office, a short walk from the manor, where Mrs. Tuttle, the postmistress, greeted her with a familiar nod. "Miss Marple, what brings you here? Not another mystery, I hope," she said, her eyes twinkling. Miss Marple smiled, her tone conspiratorial. "Merely a curiosity, Mrs. Tuttle. Have you handled any letters to Maplecroft lately, perhaps with a foreign postmark?" Mrs. Tuttle frowned, consulting her ledger. "Nothing from abroad, miss, not in days. Though a young man dropped a letter for the manor yesterday, paid extra to rush it. Said it was urgent, but he didn't give a name." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. A young man, tall, perhaps, with a quick manner. Mrs. Tuttle nodded. "That's him, lanky, in a dark coat, kept his hat low. I thought he seemed nervous." The description matched Lionel, or someone posing as a courier, and Miss Marple thanked her, her mind racing. The letter, she felt certain, was a forgery, mailed locally to bolster Lionel's alibi. But who had arranged it? A confederate, or Lionel himself? Back at the manor, the family was gathered in the library, where Constable Dobbs was holding court with his usual bluster. The locksmith, delayed by a broken cart, had yet to arrive, and the safe remained unopened, its secrets intact. Dobbs, brandishing his notebook, questioned the family about recent visitors, his tone suggesting he expected a confession at any moment. Clara, exasperated, insisted the servants be searched again, while Edmund proposed checking the village for strangers, a suggestion Miss Marple found oddly specific. Beatrice, when questioned, repeated her claim of staying in the drawing room the night of the theft, her voice mechanical and her eyes fixed on the floor. Miss Marple, knitting quietly in a corner, listened with her usual attention. The letter from Florence, she thought, was a key to the mystery, its timing too convenient to be genuine. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a forged telegram had misled the police for days. The young man at the post office, tall and nervous, fit Lionel's description, and the footprints by the conservatory, large and purposeful, suggested his presence. But why the silk scrap, and why the West Wing? Her thoughts turned to Beatrice, whose agitation seemed rooted in loyalty rather than guilt. Could she be protecting Lionel or someone else? As Dobbs droned on, Miss Marple steered the conversation. To Lionel, her tone casual. "Such a pity your nephew missed the reunion," she said, addressing Lady Haverford. "His letters are so cheerful, though. Does he often write from abroad?" Lady Haverford's smile was strained. "He's a good boy, Jane, but restless. His letters are a comfort, though they come irregularly." Clara scoffed. "If he's writing so often, why isn't he here, helping with this mess?" Her barb, aimed at Lionel, drew a flush from Edmund, who muttered about travel delays. Beatrice, silent, twisted her scarf until Miss Marple feared it would tear. The afternoon brought a flurry of activity as Dobbs organized a search of the West Wing, prompted by Clara's insistence. Miss Marple, declining to join, remained in the library, her eyes on the velvet case. The blue silk scrap, still caught on its edge, seemed to challenge her. She examined it again, noting its frayed edge and fine weave. It was identical to the scrap in the West Wing, suggesting a single saucer garment, perhaps worn by the thief. She thought of a St. Mary Mead incident, where a torn cuff had led to a tailor's shop and a confession. The silk, she decided, was a clue to pursue, though its owner remained elusive. As evening approached, Miss Marple joined Lady Haverford for tea in the morning room, where the older woman confided her fears. "Jane, this letter from Lionel Lit doesn't feel right. He's never been so prompt before." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes gentle but sharp. "People sometimes write what they wish others to believe, my dear. Like my neighbour, Mr. Thompson, who sent grand letters from London, only to be found hiding in his own attic." Her words, light as they were, deepened Lady Haverford's frown, and Miss Marple wondered if she suspected her nephew's involvement. Retiring to her room, Miss Marple opened her notebook, her pen moving swiftly. Letter from Florence, mailed locally. Young man at Post Office Lionel. Silk scraps same source. West Wing link. Beatrice's silence protecting someone. The clues were mounting, each one a stitch in the pattern she was weaving. The letter, she felt certain, was a ruse designed to keep Lionel's absence plausible. The silk, the footprints, the safe all pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of the manor, and Lionel's debts made him the likeliest candidate. She closed her notebook, her needles resuming their rhythm, and gazed out at the darkened grounds. The truth, she knew, was near, waiting for her to knit its final threads. Chapter 8. The nephew's return. The night had settled over Maplecroft Manor like a heavy velvet curtain, its darkness pierced only by the occasional flicker of lamplight from the tall windows. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her guest room with her knitting idle in her lap, gazed out at the shadowed grounds, her mind alive with the threads of the mystery that had gripped the household. The stolen cameo pendant, the footprints by the conservatory, the smudge of mud, the blue silk scraps, the hidden safe behind Lady Eleanor's portrait, and the suspicious letter from Florence formed a delicate pattern, not unlike the intricate lace she had once struggled to master in her youth. Each clue, she knew, was a stitch that, if followed, could unravel the truth, and her suspicions increasingly centered on Lionel Haverford, the absent nephew whose debts and forged letter suggested a return to the manor. The day had been one of mounting tension, with Constable Dobbs's blustering searches yielding little but irritation, and the family's unease growing as the safe remained unopened, its combination elusive. Miss Marple, ever patient, had resolved to keep watch that night, her instincts sharpened by years of observing human nature in St. Mary Mead. She recalled a case where a midnight vigil had revealed a thief's movements, and she sensed that Maplecroft, with its secrets hidden in shadows, might yield a similar revelation. Her knitting bag at her side, she settled by the window, her eyes trained on the darkened hall visible through her slightly ajar door. The manor was quiet, save for the distant creak of floorboards and the soft rustle of leaves outside. The family had retired early, exhausted by the day's fruitless inquiries, and the servants moved with hushed efficiency, their tasks nearly done. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the letter from Florence, its fresh postmark and stiff handwriting a clear forgery in her mind. The young man at the post office, described by Mrs. Tuttle as tall and nervous, matched Lionel's lanky frame, and the footprints by the conservatory large and purposeful suggested a man familiar with the manor's layout. The blue silk scraps found in the library and the West Wing were another puzzle. They're fine, we've hinting at a garment worn by someone of means, yet torn in haste. Beatrice's agitation, she suspected, stemmed from loyalty, perhaps to Lionel, whose childhood explorations of the manor made him a likely candidate for knowing the safe's existence. Near midnight, a faint creak from the staircase drew her attention. She rose, her movements silent despite her age, and slipped into the shadows of the hall, her shawl blending with the darkness. The sound came again, deliberate and stealthy, and she followed it, her heart steady but her senses alert. The staircase led to the portrait gallery, where the hidden safe lay behind Lady Eleanor's portrait, and Miss Marple's instincts told her the noise was no accident. She recalled her nephew Raymond's tales of midnight escapades, where the guilty often betrayed themselves under cover of night in the gallery. The dim glow of a single candle revealed a figure tall, lanky, clad in a dark coat fumbling with the panel behind the portrait. The frame was askew, the safe exposed, and the figure's hands moved quickly, turning the dial with a practiced air. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Looking for something, Mr. Haverford?" The figure froze, the candle flickering as he turned, and the light caught Lionel Haverford's pale, startled face. His eyes, wide with panic, darted to the door, but Miss Marple's presence, small yet commanding, held him in place. "Lionel," she said, her tone one of gentle reproof, as if scolding a wayward child. "I thought you were in Florence, writing cheerful letters to your aunt." Lionel stammered, his hands clutching the edge of the portrait frame. "Miss Marple, I came back to surprise the family. I only arrived tonight. I heard about the pendant and thought I'd check the safe." His words tumbled out, too quick to be convincing, and Miss Marple noted the bulge in his coat pocket, the nervous twitch of his fingers. "A surprise, indeed," she said, her eyes twinkling with quiet scrutiny. "But the safe, Lionel, how did you know it was here? And those footprints by the conservatory, so like a man's, and the mud on the threshold. Curious, don't you think?" Lionel's face flushed, his attempt at a smile faltering. "I used to play here as a boy. I found the safe once, in an old journal. I thought the pendant might be there." His voice lacked conviction, and Miss Marple recalled young Tommy Pierce, whose excuses had crumbled under her gentle questioning. She stepped closer, her stick tapping softly on the floor. "And the letter from Florence, posted yesterday. Such a swift post, or perhaps not from Florence at all." Lionel's eyes widened, his hand straying to his pocket, and Miss Marple's gaze followed. "People are careless, my dear," she said, her tone soft but pointed. "Even clever ones leave traces." Lionel's shoulders slumped, his defiance ebbing, but before he could speak, a soft gasp came from the doorway. Beatrice stood there, her face pale, her hands clutching her scarf. "Lionel," she whispered, her voice breaking, "you said you wouldn't come back." Her words, unguarded in their distress, confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. Beatrice had known of Lionel's return, her silence a shield for her cousin. Miss Marple, her expression kind but firm, gestured for Beatrice. "To join them, my dear, it's best to tell the truth. Secrets, like stitches, unravel when pulled too tightly." Beatrice hesitated, tears welling in her eyes, then nodded. "I saw him 2 nights ago, by the conservatory," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "He said he needed money, that he'd take the pendant and be gone. I didn't want to tell his family." Her confession, halting but sincere, hung in the air, and Lionel's face darkened with shame. Miss Marple, her heart softening, thought of young Annie Webb, whose loyalty to a wayward brother had led to a similar confession in St. Mary Mead. Before she could press further, footsteps echoed in the hall, and Lady Haverford appeared, her nightgown hastily covered by a shawl, her face a mask of shock. "Lionel, is it really you?" she exclaimed, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" Lionel, cornered, stammered an explanation, claiming he had returned to check on the family, but his words faltered under his aunt's gaze. Miss Marple, stepping forward, suggested they moved to the library, where the light was better and the conversation less likely to wake the household. In the library, the velvet case stood on its table, the blue silk scrap a silent accusation. Miss Marple, seating herself, fixed Lionel with a steady gaze. "You knew of the safe, didn't you, from your childhood explorations? And the pendant, so valuable, would solve many troubles." Lionel's eyes dropped, his hands twisting in his lap. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he muttered. "The debts, they were crushing me. I thought I could take it, sell it, and no one would know." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of understanding rather than judgment. "Desperation makes fools of us all," she said, recalling a St. Mary Mead merchant who had stolen to save his shop. "But the silk line, did it come from?" "It's not Beatrice's, nor any servant's." Lionel hesitated, then admitted, "It's from a scarf I bought in London, for a friend. I must have torn it when I opened the case." His confession, though reluctant, fit the clues, and Miss Marple noted the absence of embroidery on the silk, matching his description. Beatrice, tears streaming down her face, confirmed his story. "I found the other scrap in the West Wing, where he hid before coming in. I didn't know what to do." Her voice broke, and Lady Haverford, her own eyes wet, placed a hand on her niece's shoulder. "Oh, Beatrice, why didn't you tell?" "Me," she said, her voice heavy with sorrow. Miss Marple, watching them, thought of her friend Mrs. Bantry, whose tact had often mended family rifts. The truth, she knew, was painful but necessary. She turned to Lionel, her voice gentle but firm. "The pendant, Lionel, where is it now?" He hesitated, his hand straying to his pocket, and Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "People are careless, my dear, even in their hiding places." Lionel, defeated, reached into his coat and produced the cameo pendant, its sardonyx carving glinting in the lamplight. Lady Haverford gasped, her hand flying to her throat, while Beatrice sobbed quietly. "I'm sorry," Lionel whispered, his voice breaking. "I thought it was the only way." Miss Marple, her needle still in her lap, nodded thoughtfully. The footprints, the mud, the silk, the forged letteral had led to this moment, the pattern complete. She thought of a St. Mary Mead case, where a stolen locket had been found in a poacher's pocket, revealed by a single clue. "We must call Constable Dobbs," she said, her tone calm but resolute. "But first, Lionel, tell us how you did it. The truth, like knitting, is stronger when all the stitches are in place." Lionel, his defiance gone, recounted his plan. Returning under cover of night, entering through the conservatory, using an old key he had kept from childhood. He had opened the case, snagging his scarf, and moved the pendant to the safe, intending to retrieve it later. The letter from Florence, he admitted, was sent by a friend in the village, a desperate attempt to maintain his alibi. Miss Marple listened, her mind checking each detail against the clues, satisfied that the web had been fully woven. As the family waited for Dobbs, Miss Marple sat back, her knitting resumed, her eyes gentle but vigilant. The pendant was safe, the thief revealed, but the family's wounds would take time to heal. She thought of her village, where secrets, once uncovered, often led to reconciliation. The truth, she knew, was a needle that stitched hearts as well as mysteries, and Maplecroft, with its shadows, was no exception. Chapter 9. The Confrontation. The first light of dawn crept through the heavy drapes of Maplecroft Manor's library, casting a pale glow over the somber gathering within. The air, thick with the scent of old books and lingering tension, seemed to hold its breath as the Haverford family faced the revelation of Lionel's return and the recovery of the stolen cameo pendant. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, her knitting needles silent for once, observed the scene with her characteristic, quiet intensity. The footprints by the conservatory, the smudge of mud, the blue silk scraps, the hidden safe, and the forged letter from Florence had woven a delicate pattern in her mind, now complete with Lionel's confession. Yet, like the intricate shawls she crafted for St. Mary Mead's church bazaar, the final stitches required care to ensure the truth held firm. The library, with its towering shelves and polished mahogany, was a fitting stage for the confrontation that unfolded. Lady Haverford stood by the velvet case, the pendant now resting within, its sardonyx carving glinting faintly in the morning light. Her face, etched with sorrow and relief, bore the weight of a family betrayed yet restored. Clara, her daughter, stood rigid, her sharp features taut with anger, her hands clenched as if restraining a torrent of words. Edmund, his scholarly demeanour frayed, adjusted his spectacles repeatedly, his eyes darting between Lionel and the floor. Beatrice, pale and tear-streaked, clutched a handkerchief, her earlier silence now broken by the confession she had made. In the portrait gallery, Lionel, the centre of the storm, sat slumped in a chair, his lanky frame deflated. The dark coat that had concealed his movements discarded beside him. Miss Marple, her shawl neatly folded over her arm, had summoned Constable Dobbs at first light, her calm insistence cutting through the family's shock. The constable, his walrus moustache bristling with self-importance, stood by the table, his notebook open, though his questions had been preempted by Miss Marple's quiet authority. She had gathered the family here, in the room where the theft had first been discovered, to lay bare the truth, much as she had once done in St. Mary Mead's village hall when a stolen alms box had divided the parish. People, she had said then, are never as clever as they think, and the truth, like a dropped stitch, always shows itself. She began, her voice soft but commanding, addressing the family with the gentle firmness of a schoolmistress. We have the pendant back, which is a blessing, but the how and why of its taking must be clear. Lionel, you've told us part of the story, but let us have it all, for clarity's sake. Her eyes, sharp despite her age, fixed on the young man, who shifted uncomfortably, his hands twisting in his lap. The family's gazes followed hers, a mix of accusation and pity, and Miss Marple noted the way Clara's lips tightened, Edmund's shoulders hunched, and Beatrice's eyes welled with fresh tears. Lionel, his voice low and halting, began to speak, his earlier defiance replaced by resignation. It was the debts, he said, his eyes fixed on the floor. They'd piled up cards, horses, bad investments. I couldn't face Aunt Eleanor, not after she'd helped me before. I heard about the reunion, the pendant being shown, and I thought, if I could take it, sell it quietly, I'd be free. His words, raw with shame, hung in the air, and Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead merchant, Mr. Hargreaves, whose gambling debts had led to a similar act of desperation. She nodded, encouraging him to continue. And the safe, Lionel? How did you know of it? Lionel hesitated, then admitted, I found an old journal in the attic, years ago, when I was a boy. It was Sir Reginald's, tucked in a trunk. It mentioned a safe behind Lady Eleanor's portrait, where he kept his treasures. I never told anyone, but I remembered. His voice faltered, and Miss Marple's mind ticked over the detail. Satisfied that it fit the scuff mark she had noticed on the panelling, a sign of recent tampering, and the letter from Florence. She prompted, her tone gentle but insistent. Lionel's face flushed. I paid a friend in the village, Tom Wheeler, to post it. He's got a cousin who travels, and they faked the postmark. I thought it'd keep everyone thinking I was abroad. His confession, though reluctant, matched Mrs. Tuttle's description of the nervous young man at the post office, and Miss Marple's suspicions about the forged letter were confirmed. She thought of a St. Mary Mead case, where a forged telegram had misled the police for days, only to unravel under scrutiny. Clara, unable to contain herself, broke in, her voice sharp as a blade. You thought you could steal from us, Lionel, from your own family, and drag Beatrice into it. Her accusation, laced with contempt, drew a sob from Beatrice, who shook her head. I didn't help him, Clara, I swear. I only saw him by the conservatory, and he begged me to stay quiet. I thought, he's family. Her voice broke, and Miss Marple's heart softened, recalling young Annie Webb, whose loyalty to a wayward brother had led to a similar tearful confession. Edmund, silent until now, cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. You should have come to us, Lionel. We could have helped. His words, meant to be kind, carried a note of guilt, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes avoided Lionel's. Did he suspect more, or had he known of Lionel's return? His suggestion to search the attics, made earlier, now seemed less random. Perhaps a subconscious attempt to steer Dobbs away from the portrait gallery. Lady Haverford, her hands trembling, stepped forward, her voice heavy with sorrow. Lionel, how could you? That pendant is our legacy, not a trinket to pawn. Her eyes, wet with tears, held a mother's disappointment, and Lionel's head sank lower. Miss Marple, watching them, thought of her friend Mrs. Bantry, whose tact had often mended family rifts. The Haverfords, she sensed, were at a crossroads, their bond strained but not broken. She turned to Dobbs, who had been scribbling furiously, his face red with the thrill of a solved case. Constable, I believe Lionel's coat may hold one final clue. The silk scraps, you see, came from a scarf he mentioned a London purchase, torn in haste. Dobbs, eager to act, approached Lionel, who reluctantly stood and handed over his dark coat. From the pocket, Dobbs produced the pendant already seen in the gallery, but also a folded silk scarf, its blue hue matching the scraps found in the library and west wing. The frayed edge, torn where it had caught on the velvet case, confirmed Lionel's story, and Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. The scarf, Lionel? She asked, her tone mild but probing. He nodded, his voice barely audible. I wore it that night, to keep my face hidden. It caught on the case when I opened it, and again in the west wing, where I waited before going to the gallery. His admission tied the clues together, and Miss Marple's mind checked each detail. The footprints matching his boots, the mud from the path beyond the EUs, the scratched locks from his old key, and the silk from his scarf. The pattern was complete. The stitches aligned. Beatrice, sobbing openly now, spoke up. I found the other scrap in the west wing, near the guest rooms. I thought it was mine at first, but I didn't want to say anything. I was afraid for him. Her confession, raw and unguarded, drew a sigh from Lady Haverford, who placed a hand on her niece's shoulder. Clara, her anger softening, shook her head. You should have told us, Beatrice. We're not monsters. Her words, though sharp, held a trace of forgiveness, and Miss Marple noted the shift so like the reconciliations she had witnessed in her village. Dobbs, puffing out his chest, declared Lionel under arrest, though his tones suggested he credited himself with the solution. "We'll take him to the station, your ladyship, and sort this out proper." Miss Marple, her expression serene, said nothing, content to let him claim the glory. She knew, as did Lady Haverford, that the truth had been hers to uncover, pieced together from the small things others overlooked. She thought of a St. Mary Mead case, where a stolen locket had been found in a poacher's pocket, revealed by a single thread. As Dobbs led Lionel away, the family remained, their silence heavy, with the weight of betrayal sanctioned. Lady Haverford, clutching the pendant, turned to Miss Marple. "Jane, how did you know? The silk, the letter, all of it." Miss Marple smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm. "People are careless, my dear. They leave traces, like stitches. In a pattern, one only needs to look." Her words, gentle but profound, drew a nod from Lady Haverford, who clasped her hand in gratitude. The family dispersed, their steps slow and heavy, and Miss Marple lingered in the library, her eyes on the velvet case. The pendant, safe at last, seemed to glow with the weight of its history. She thought of her village, where secrets, once uncovered, often led to healing. The Haverfords, she hoped, would find their way, their bonds mended by the truth. She picked up her knitting, her heart light, and turned her thoughts to the journey home, where new patterns awaited. Chapter 10. The motive unravelled. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Maplecroft Manor's library, casting a warm glow over the polished mahogany and the velvet case that now held the recovered cameo pendant. The air, heavy with the scent of old books and wax polish, carried a quiet relief, though the wounds of betrayal lingered like an echo in the room. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar corner with her knitting bag at her side, observed the Haverford family with her characteristic gentle scrutiny. The confrontation with Lionel the previous night had laid bare the truth, but the why and how of his actions still required careful unpicking, like a tangled skein of wool from her St. Mary Mead knitting circle. The footprints by the conservatory, the mud smudge, the blue silk scraps, the hidden safe, and the forged letter had woven a pattern, now complete. Yet Miss Marple knew that understanding the motive was as vital as recovering the pendant. The library was quieter than it had been in days. The family gathered not in accusation, but in a subdued effort to make sense of the ordeal. Lady Haverford, her silver hair neatly pinned, stood by the fireplace, her hands clasped around a cup of tea, her face etched with a mother's sorrow for her errant nephew. Clara, her usual sharpness softened by the night's revelations, sat with a newspaper unopened in her lap, her eyes distant but less accusing. Edmund, his spectacles polished to a gleam, leafed through a notebook, though his frequent glances at his mother suggested his thoughts were elsewhere. Beatrice, her eyes red from crying, sat close to Lady Haverford, her plain scarf a stark contrast to the blue shawl she had abandoned. The other relatives, sensing the matter was resolved, had retreated to their rooms, leaving the core of the family to face the aftermath. Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, turned her thoughts to Lionel's confession, his admission of debt, his use of an old key to enter through the conservatory, and his knowledge of the safe behind Lady Eleanor's portrait had tied the clues together. But the deeper currents of his motive, desperation, shame, and a misguided sense of necessity required exploration. She recalled a St. Mary Mead merchant, Mr. Jenkins, whose theft of church funds had stemmed from a similar spiral of debt, revealed only when his wife's tears had prompted a confession. Motives, she knew, were the heart of any mystery, and Lionel's story, though clear in its mechanics, needed airing to heal the family's wounds. Lady Haverford, setting down her cup, broke the silence. "Jane, you've done us a great service, but I still can't fathom why Lionel would betray us so. He was always a restless boy, but this—" Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle understanding. "People, my dear, often act against their better natures when pressed by need. Shall we have Lionel explain so we may understand?" Her suggestion, delivered with quiet authority, drew nods from the family, and Constable Dobbs, who had remained to oversee Lionel's custody, was summoned to bring him to the library. Lionel entered, his lanky frame hunched, his face pale but resolute. The dark coat, now evidence of his guilt, had been replaced by a plain jacket, and his hands, free of cuffs at Lady Haverford's insistence, twisted nervously. Dobbs, standing by the door, puffed out his chest, his notebook ready, though Miss Marple suspected he would contribute little to the conversation. She rose, her shawl slipping slightly, and addressed Lionel with the calm firmness of a village matron. "Lionel, you've told us how you took the pendant, but we must understand why. Tell us plainly, for your aunt's sake." Lionel swallowed, his eyes fixed on the floor. "It was the money," he began, his voice low but steady. "I owed thousands cards, loans, a bad deal in London. They were pressing me, threatening to ruin me. I couldn't ask Aunt Eleanor against she'd bailed me out before, and I was ashamed." His words, raw with self-reproach, stirred a sigh. From Lady Haverford and Miss Marple noted Clara's softening expression, her anger giving way to pity. Lionel continued, "I remembered the pendant from childhood stories, how valuable it was. When I heard about the reunion, I saw a chance. I thought I could take it, sell it abroad, and no one would know." Miss Marple, her eyes sharp but kind, prompted, "And the safe? You knew of it from Sir Reginald's journal?" Lionel nodded, his hands stilling. "I found it years ago, in the attic, hidden in a box of old papers. It described the safe behind Lady Eleanor's portrait, where Sir Reginald kept his treasures. I thought I'd move the pendant there, retrieve it later, when the fuss died down." His plan, though flawed, showed a desperate cunning, and Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead case, where a young man had hidden stolen goods in a hayloft, only to be caught by a stray feather. "And the silk scraps?" she asked, her tone gentle but probing. "Your scarf, torn in haste?" Lionel's face flushed. "Yes, it was a scarf I bought in London for someone. It caught on the velvet case when I opened it, and again in the West Wing, where I hid before going to the gallery. I didn't notice until it was too late." His admission confirmed the connection between the library and West Wing scraps, and Miss Marple's mind ticked over the detail, satisfied that it fit the frayed edges she had observed. Beatrice, her voice trembling, spoke up. "I found the scrap in the West Wing, Lionel. I thought it was mine at first, and I was so afraid for you." Her confession, tearful but sincere, drew a nod from Lady Haverford, who reached for her niece's hand. Clara, her voice softer now, said, "You should have told us, Beatrice. We might have stopped this madness." Her words, though edged, held a trace of forgiveness, and Miss Marple noted the shift, so like the reconciliations she had witnessed in her village after a scandal. Edmund, silent until now, cleared his throat. "Lionel, why didn't you come to me? I could have helped, or at least tried." His tone, tinged with guilt, suggested he felt responsible, perhaps for not noticing his cousin's distress. Miss Marple, watching him, wondered if his earlier suggestion to search the attics had been a subconscious attempt to protect Lionel, or to distance himself from suspicion. His unease, she thought, was not guilt but a scholar's regret for missing the signs. Lionel, his eyes meeting Edmund's for the first time, shook his head. "I was too proud, Chalter system, far gone to be a thief, Edmund." His voice broke, and he looked away. "I couldn't face you, any of you. I thought I could fix it myself." The admission hung heavy in the air, and Miss Marple's heart softened, though her gaze remained steady. She recalled a St. Mary Mead boy caught stealing from the church, whose shame had been his heaviest burden. Lionel's motive, she understood, was not malice but desperation, a universal failing that she had seen in many forms. And the letter from Florence? Lady Haverford asked, her voice steady but pained. Lionel's shoulders slumped further. "I had Tom Wheeler's cousin, who travels to Italy, fake the postmark. I paid him to mail it from the village, to make it seem I was still abroad." The confession, already known to Miss Marple, drew gasps from Clara and Edmund, who had not heard the full details. Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions about the forged letter now fully confirmed. She thought of a St. Mary Mead incident, where a falsified note had nearly ruined a young couple, only to be undone by a careful eye. Dobbs, eager to assert his authority, stepped forward. "That's fraud, that is, on top of theft. You'll answer for it, Mr. Haverford." His tone was officious, but Miss Marple's calm presence overshadowed his bluster. She addressed Lionel gently. The scarf, Lionel, was it meant for someone special? The question, seemingly innocuous, caught him off guard, and he flushed. "Yes, a lady friend in London. She liked fine things." The detail, small but humanizing, softened Lady Haverford's expression, and Miss Marple noted the flicker of compassion in her eyes. The confrontation turned to practicalities as Lady Haverford insisted on leniency. "He must face justice, Jane, but he's family. Can we not find a way?" Miss Marple, her needles still in her lap, nodded thoughtfully. "Justice, my dear, can take many forms. In my village, we sometimes settle matters quietly when the heart is true." Her words, gentle but firm, suggested a path forward, though she left the decision to Lady Haverford. Dobbs, grumbling, agreed to consult the magistrate. But his authority was clearly secondary to Miss Marple's quiet influence. As the family discussed Lionel's fate, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the broader pattern. The footprints, the mud, the silk, the safe, the letter, all had pointed to Lionel, but the motive, rooted in shame and desperation, was the key that unlocked the family's understanding. She recalled her friend Mrs. Bantry's wisdom. People hurt most when they're hiding from themselves. The Haverfords, she hoped, would heal through truth, as her village often had. Lionel, his head bowed, was led away by Dobbs, his steps heavy but his face resigned. The family remained, their silence a mix of relief and sorrow. Miss Marple, picking up her knitting, resumed her stitching, her heart light with the satisfaction of a puzzle solved. The pendant, safe in its case, gleamed with the Roswellian history. And the manor, she knew, would find its way back to the family, their bonds mended by the truth she had woven. Chapter 11. The manor's peace restored. The late morning sun bathed Maplecroft Manor in a golden haze, softening the sharp edges of its ancient stone walls and casting dappled light through the library's tall windows. The air, scented with the faint musk of old books and the lingering warmth of a dying fire, carried a quiet relief, as if the manor itself exhaled after days of tension. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner with her knitting bag at her side, observed the Haverford family with her characteristic, gentle scrutiny. The recovery of the cameo pendant and Lionel's confession had unravelled the mystery, but the family's wounds, like a poorly mended seam, required careful stitching to heal. The footprints, the mud, the blue silk scraps, the hidden safe, and the forged letter had formed a pattern now complete. And Miss Marple knew that the final task was to ensure the manor's peace was restored, much like the quiet resolutions she had facilitated in St. Mary Mead. The library, with its polished mahogany and rows of leather-bound volumes, was a haven of calm after the storm of the previous night's confrontation. Lady Haverford stood by the velvet case, the pendant gleaming within, its sardonyx carving a silent testament to the family's resilience. Her face, though still marked by sorrow, held a newfound strength, as if the truth had lightened her burden. Clara, her sharp edges softened by the ordeal, sat with a cup of tea, her gaze less accusing, her hands steady for the first time in days. Edmund, his scholarly demeanour returning, was sorting through a stack of papers, though his occasional glances at his mother suggested a lingering concern. Beatrice, her eyes no longer red from tears, sat close to Lady Haverford, her plain scarf replaced by a soft cardigan, a sign of her tentative return to ease. Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, turned her thoughts to the aftermath of life. Actions. His confession had laid bare his desperation, driven by debts and shame, but the family's responsibility mingled with just a softened hope for reconciliation. She recalled a St. Mary Mead incident, where a young man's theft from the church had been forgiven after restitution, the village knitting together through compassion. The Haverfords, she sensed, were at a similar crossroads, their bonds tested but not broken. Her role, as always, was to guide them toward mending. Her quiet observations, as effective as any sermon. Lady Haverford, setting down her cup, addressed the family, her voice steady but warm. "We've been through a trial, my dears, but the pendant is safe, and Lionel will face his consequences. I propose we move forward together." Her words, simple yet resolute, drew nods from Clara and Edmund, though Beatrice's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Miss Marple, seizing the moment, spoke softly, her tone as gentle as her knitting wool. "Families, like villages, are strongest when they face the truth. In St. Mary Mead, we've seen many a storm pass, and the sun always returns." Her words, light but profound, stirred the family. Clara, her voice softer than usual, said, "You're right, Miss Marple. Lionel was foolish, but he's ours. We'll see him through this." Her admission, devoid of her usual sharpness, suggested a shift, and Miss Marple noted the way Edmund's shoulders relaxed, as if a weight had lifted. Beatrice, her voice trembling, added, "I should have spoken sooner. I was so afraid for him." Her confession, though redundant, was a release, and Lady Haverford reached for her hand, a gesture of forgiveness that echoed the reconciliations Miss Marple had witnessed in her village. The conversation turned to the safe, its discovery. Behind Lady Eleanor's portrait, a lingering puzzle. Miss Marple, her eyes twinkling, suggested a practical step. "The combination, my dear, might be simpler than we think. People often choose dates that mean something, birthdays, anniversaries. Sir Reginald, being sentimental, might have used his own birth year. Lady Haverford, thoughtful, provided the date 1842, and Edmund, eager to contribute, offered to try it. They moved to the portrait gallery, the family trailing behind, their steps lighter than they had been in days. In the gallery, the portrait of Lady Eleanor gazed down with serene indifference, its frame now properly aligned. Edmund, with careful hands, turned the safe's dial. Entering 1842, a soft click sounded, and the door swung open, revealing a small compartment containing a bundle of yellowed letters and a single pearl earring. The family gasped, and Lady Haverford's hand flew to her throat. "Sir Reginald's letters," she whispered, "and Eleanor's earring. I thought it lost years ago." The discovery, though modest, felt like a gift, and Miss Marple smiled, recalling a St. Mary Mead case where a hidden cache had healed a family's rift. Edmund, his scholarly curiosity piqued, examined the letters, their faded ink revealing Sir Reginald's musings on the pendant's history. "He writes of it as a talisman," he said, his voice tinged with awe. "A gift to Eleanor, meant to protect the family." The words, read aloud, brought a quiet reverence to the room, and Miss Marple noted the way Clara's eyes softened, as if seeing the pendant anew. Beatrice, touching the earring, murmured, "It's like finding them again." Her words, simple but heartfelt, suggested a healing that Miss Marple had hoped for. The family returned to the library, the letters and earring placed beside the pendant, a trio of relics that bound them to their past. Miss Marple, settling back into her chair, steered the conversation to Lionel's future. "He'll face the magistrate," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "But with your support, he may find his way. My neighbour, Mr. Thompson, once fell into trouble, but a kind word turned him round." Her story, drawn from St. Mary Mead's endless well of human failings, resonated with Lady Haverford, who nodded. "We'll stand by him, Jane. He's young, and mistakes can be mended." Clara, her voice steady, proposed a practical plan. "We'll pay his debts, within reason, and ensure he works to repay us. He's not a bad sort, just lost." Her pragmatism, tempered by compassion, drew a nod from Edmund, who added, "Oh, help him find work, perhaps in the city. He's clever when he's not reckless." Beatrice, her voice stronger now, said, "I'll write to him to let him know we're here." The family's resolve, woven together in that moment, felt like a St. Mary Mead gathering, where neighbours rallied to mend a broken soul. Miss Marple, her needles resuming their rhythm, turned her thoughts to the clues that had led her here. The footprints, matching Lionel's boots, had pointed to his presence. The mud from the path beyond the EUs had marked his entry. The silk scraps, torn from his scarf, had linked the library and west wing. The forged letter, mailed by a Confederate, had maintained his alibi, and the safe, known from childhood explorations, had been his target. Each clue, small but telling, had formed a pattern, and Miss Marple's patience had knitted them together. She recalled her friend Mrs. Bantry's saying, "The smallest things tell the biggest stories." The Haverfords, she sensed, had learned that lesson. As noon approached, Constable Dobbs returned, his face red from the morning's exertions. He reported that Lionel had been taken to the magistrate, who would likely impose a fine and probation, given the family's willingness to intervene. A lucky lad, that one, Dobbs grumbled, though his tone suggested he was pleased to close the case. Miss Marple, saying little, let him take the credit. Her satisfaction derived from the family's healing rather than public acclaim. She thought of a St. Mary Mead case, where a stolen locket had been returned quietly. The village stronger for it, the family, sensing the matter resolved, began to plan for the future. Edmund, his scholarly zeal restored, proposed cataloguing the manor's artifacts to prevent future surprises. "We'll map every nook and cranny," he said, his eyes bright. Clara, her practicality in full force, suggested reinforcing the locks and hiring a steward to oversee the estate. Beatrice, her confidence returning, offered to help with the catalogue, her hands steady for the first time in days. Lady Haverford, watching them, smiled, her strength renewed. "We'll make Maplecroft a home again," she said, her voice firm. Miss Marple, her knitting a soft counterpoint to their plans, felt a quiet pride. The pendant, safe in its case, was more than a jewel, it was a symbol of the family's resilience. She thought of her village, where truths, once uncovered, often led to renewal. The Haverfords, she hoped, would find their way, their bonds strengthened by the ordeal. As the family dispersed to their tasks, Lady Haverford approached her, her eyes warm with gratitude. "Jane, you've given us back more than the pendant. How can we thank you?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "My dear, a cup of tea and a quiet chat are thanks enough. People are much the same everywhere, and I'm glad to help them find their way." Her words, simple but profound, drew a laugh from Lady Haverford, who clasped her hand. The manor, Miss Marple knew, would heal, its peace restored like a well-knitted shawl, strong and whole. Chapter 12. The journey home. The midday sun hung high over the rolling hills of St. Mary Mead, its light filtering through the train's dusty windows as Miss Jane Marple settled into her seat, her knitting bag tucked beside her. The rhythm of the wheels on the tracks was a soothing counterpoint to the whirl of thoughts in her mind, each click and clatter echoing the delicate pattern she had unravelled at Maplecroft Manor, the theft of the cameo pendant, now safely restored. To its velvet case had been a puzzle of human frailties, greed, loyalty, and redemption woven together by the clues of footprints, mud, silk scraps, a hidden safe, and a forged letter. Like the intricate shawls she crafted for the village bazaar, the mystery had required patience to complete, and now, with the Haverford family on the path to healing, Miss Marple felt the quiet satisfaction of a task well done. The train compartment, with its worn upholstery and faint scent of coal, was nearly empty, save for a young mother opposite, coaxing a toddler with a biscuit. Miss Marple, her needles idle in her lap, gazed out at the passing countryside, where fields of golden stubble and hedgerows blurred into a familiar tapestry. The events at Maplecroft seemed almost dreamlike now, yet each detail remained sharp in her memory. The large footprints by the conservatory, the smudge of mud on the threshold, the blue silk scraps torn from Lionel's scarf, the safe behind, Lady Eleanor's portrait, and the letter from Florence, its forged postmark betraying his presence. These clues, small but telling, had led her to Lionel's desperate act, and his confession had mended the family's bonds, much as her village had often rallied around a fallen neighbour. Her thoughts drifted to Lady Haverford, whose strength had shone through her sorrow, and to Clara, whose sharp edges had softened under the weight of truth. Edmund's scholarly zeal now turned to cataloguing the manor's secrets, promised a future free of hidden surprises, while Beatrice's tearful confession had freed her from the burden of loyalty. Lionel, facing justice, but buoyed by his family's support, reminded Miss Marple of young Tommy Pierce, whose theft of apples had been forgiven after a summer of honest work. Families, she mused, were like villagers. They weathered storms when truth was their guide. The train rattled past a familiar church spire, and Miss Marple's mind turned to St. Mary Mead, where her cottage awaited, its rose garden and cosy parlour. A haven after the manor's grandeur. She recalled her niece Joan's teasing remark, "Aunt Jane, you see too much. and it's positively alarming." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes crinkling. Perhaps she did see too much, but that, she thought, was precisely the point. The small things, gestures, glances, misplaced, thread-stoled stories that others overlooked, and her knack for noticing them had served the Haverfords well. She opened her knitting bag, retrieving a small notebook where she recorded her observations. A habit born of years unraveling village mysteries. Flipping through its pages, she reviewed the Maplecroft case, footprints Lionel's from the woods, mud path beyond use, silk Scraps's scarf, torn in haste, safe known from Sir Reginald's journal, letter forged by a village confederate. Each entry, written in her neat hand, was a stitch in the pattern, and the final note, added that morning, read, "Family reconciled, pendant restored." She closed the notebook, satisfied that the puzzle was complete, though her mind lingered on the human elements, the frailties that had driven Lionel and the compassion that had saved him. The train slowed as it approached St. Mary Mead's station, its platform bustling with familiar faces. Mrs. Price Ridley, her hat askew, arguing with the station master, young Mary Pritchard, waving to a departing friend, and Mr. Clement, the vicar, carrying a parcel of books. Miss Marple gathered her things, her movements slow but deliberate, and stepped onto the platform, the autumn air crisp against her cheeks. The village, with its thatched cottages and winding lanes, welcomed her like an old friend, and she felt a quiet joy at being home as she walked to her cottage, her stick tapping the cobblestones. She reflected on the Haverford case. It had been, in many ways, like her village mysteries, a tangle of motives and secrets, unravelled by patience and observation. She thought of her friend, Mrs. Bantry, whose knack for stumbling into scandals had taught her the value of listening. The Haverfords, like St. Mary Mead's residents, had faced their truth and found a way forward, their bonds strengthened by the ordeal. Miss Marple's role, as always, had been to guide them gently, her quiet presence a catalyst for clarity. At her cottage, the roses were in full bloom, their scent mingling with the earthy aroma of the garden. She unlocked the door, her parlour, as she had left it, the chintz curtains, the worn armchair, the tea tray waiting by the hearth. Her maid, Cherry, had left a note, tea in the tin, biscuits fresh, fire ready to light. Miss Marple smiled, her heart warmed by the simplicity of home. She set her knitting bag on the table, its contents a reminder of the patterns she wove, both in wool and in truth. As she prepared tea, her thoughts returned to Maplecroft, Lady Haverford's gratitude, expressed in a heartfelt letter tucked into her bag, had been thanks enough, though Miss Marple valued the quiet resolution more than praise. The pendant, safe in its case, was a symbol of the family's resilience, much like the church bell in St. Mary Mead, which rang through every storm. She recalled a case in the village where a stolen brooch had been returned after a tearful confession, the community stronger for it. The Haverfords, she hoped, would find similar strength, settling into her armchair. Miss Marple opened her knitting, the needles resuming their familiar rhythm. The wool, a soft blue not unlike the silk scraps, reminded her of the clues that had led her to Lionel. Each stitch, she thought, was like a clue, small, seemingly insignificant, but essential to the whole. She recalled her niece Joan's laughter. "Aunt Jane, you make mysteries out of nothing." Yet it was the nothings, the glances, the hesitations, the misplaced threads that told the story. Her mind wandered to the future, to Lionel's path under the magistrate's ruling, and to the family's plans to catalogue the manor's secrets. Edmund's zeal, Clara's pragmatism, and Beatrice's newfound courage would serve them well, she thought, much as her village rallied around its own. She considered writing to Lady Haverford, offering a few words of encouragement, but decided to wait. The family needed time, as St. Mary Mead often did after a scandal, to knit their bonds anew. The fire crackled, its warmth spreading through the parlour, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the village. Mrs. Price Ridley, no doubt, would have a new tale of gossip, and Mr. Clement would want to hear of her adventure. She smiled, imagining their reactions: Mrs. Price Ridley's indignation, Mr. Clement's quiet amusement. The village, like Maplecroft, was a tapestry of human nature, its flaws and virtues woven together. Miss Marple's role, as always, was to observe, to listen, to guide. Her quiet presence a thread that strengthened the whole dot as evening fell. She rose to close the curtains, the twilight casting long shadows across the garden. The stars were beginning to emerge, their light a reminder of the clarity that followed darkness. She thought of Lionel, whose desperation had led to theft, but whose confession had opened the door to redemption. She thought of Beatrice, whose loyalty had faltered, but whose courage had prevailed. And she thought of Lady Haverford, whose strength had held the family together, much like Miss Marple's own village, where truth always found a way. Returning to her chair, she picked up her knitting, the blue wool soft under her fingers. The pattern, nearly complete, was a simple one, yet it held the same satisfaction as solving a mystery. She recalled her friend Mrs. Bantry's words: "Jane, you see the world in a skein of wool." Perhaps she did, but the world, she knew, was made of such skeins, threads of human nature, knotted and tangled, but capable of beauty when carefully woven. The clock on the mantel chimed, and Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her heart light. The Maplecroft case was closed, its lessons learned, and St. Mary Mead awaited her, its own mysteries no doubt brewing. She smiled, her eyes crinkling, and prepared for bed, ready for whatever puzzle life might bring next. The truth, like her knitting, was always there, waiting for a patient hand to shape it.